I found the holocron in a forgotten archive beneath the Imperial Palace, 3 levels below what the architectural schematics acknowledged existed, in a chamber that smelled of dust and ozone and something else I couldn't identify, something organic that had no place in a sealed Durasteel vault that hadn't been opened in decades. I was a historical records technician then, promoted recently from data entry to archival restoration, given security clearance that allowed me access to materials the Empire had confiscated from the Jedi Temple after its purging, after Lord Vader had led the 501st through those halls and extinguished every light that had burned there for 1,000 generations. My supervisor, a thin man named Krennic who never made eye contact, had assigned me to catalog force-sensitive artifacts for eventual destruction, explaining in his flat voice that these objects represented dangerous superstition that had no place in the rational order the Emperor was constructing, that my duty was documentation before disposal, nothing more, nothing less. The holocron was small, smaller than my fist, its surface etched with geometric patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, blue-green luminescence pulsing from within like a heartbeat, or perhaps like breathing, slow and deliberate and utterly alien. The documentation tag indicated it had been recovered from a meditation chamber in the temple's deepest levels, sealed in a container marked with warnings in Old Galactic that I couldn't fully translate, but whose tone suggested profound danger, the kind of danger that transcended physical threat and entered territory that rational Imperial thinking claimed didn't exist. I should have logged it immediately, should have followed protocol and submitted it for destruction without examination, but something about the object's presence created a pressure in my mind, a weight that felt almost like curiosity but deeper, more compulsive, as though the holocron itself was expressing interest in me rather than the reverse. I activated it in my quarters after my shift ended, knowing this violated at least 6 security protocols and probably constituted treason under the Imperial regulations regarding Force artifacts, but unable to resist the compulsion that had been building since I'd first touched the object and felt its warmth seep through my gloves into my palms. The activation was simple, just a matter of channeling intention toward the object while touching specific geometric points in sequence, the pattern somehow obvious despite never having been taught, as though the holocron was instructing me in its own operation through means that bypassed normal sensory channels. Light erupted from the device, coalescing into a miniature figure perhaps 20 centimeters tall, a being of species I'd never encountered, skin wrinkled and green, ears oversized and pointed, eyes that contained depths, suggesting either profound wisdom or something pretending to be wisdom, while being actually something else entirely. The hologram spoke, its voice raspy and ancient, accent unfamiliar, syntax inverted in ways that suggested either the recording's age or the speaker's alien neurology processing galactic basic through linguistic structures never designed for it. It introduced itself as Yoda, Jedi Master, Grand Master of the Order, keeper of traditions extending back 900 years, teacher of thousands of students across centuries of service to the Force and to the Republic that the Force had apparently served, or at least not opposed, during its millennium of supposed peace and prosperity. The introduction should have been mere historical curiosity, biographical data about a being who'd presumably died during the Purge, along with the rest of his order. But something in the hologram's eyes created a sensation I'd learned to recognize during my work with Force artifacts. The feeling that I was being observed from within the recording itself, that consciousness persisted in these devices beyond mere electromagnetic storage of information. The holocron's primary content was teaching, lessons about the Force and its nature, about the relationship between individual consciousness and the cosmic energy that supposedly connected all living things. about techniques for manipulating this energy through meditation and discipline and surrender to something the hologram called the will of the Force, as though the universe possessed intentions and individuals could align themselves with these intentions through proper training and philosophical orientation. The Empire's official position was that the Force was superstitious nonsense, that the Emperor's abilities were simply advanced psychological techniques and perhaps some minor telekinetic capacity amplified through technology, that the Jedi had been frauds who'd used elaborate tricks and Republic authority to maintain their position as a quasi-religious elite that had corrupted galactic governance for centuries. But I'd cataloged enough artifacts and read enough confiscated materials to know the official position was propaganda, that Force abilities were real and that the Emperor was himself a practitioner whose power exceeded anything the Jedi had publicly demonstrated. What disturbed me about the holocron's teachings wasn't their content, which was mostly philosophical meditation on topics like compassion and attachment and the danger of desire distorting perception, but rather the way they seemed to address my specific psychological state, as though the recording had been designed to respond to viewers' individual circumstances, despite being fixed electromagnetic data that couldn't actually adapt to new contexts. The hologram spoke about fear and how fear of loss led to attachment that led to jealousy and possessiveness, that led to actions that created the very losses that had been feared, the cycle feeding itself until beings became trapped in patterns that destroyed what they most wanted to protect. It spoke about anger and how anger provided temporary power at the cost of long-term corruption, how beings who channeled rage became progressively less capable of experiencing other emotions until they existed in states of perpetual fury that consumed everything human in their consciousness. It spoke about the dark side and how the dark side promised strength but delivered only dependence, how users became addicted to its power until they couldn't function without it. Their identities progressively eroded until nothing remained except the dark side wearing their faces like masks. I watched the teachings compulsively over the following weeks, activating the holocron each night in my quarters, the blue-green light washing over my walls, while the ancient voice explained Force philosophy in its inverted syntax and raspy tone. My work performance deteriorated as sleep deprivation accumulated, as the teachings occupied more of my conscious attention, even when the holocron was deactivated, as I found myself analyzing imperial policy and my role in it through frameworks the hologram had introduced. I began noticing patterns I'd previously dismissed or rationalized, seeing the Empire's structure as a massive expression of the dark side principles the holocron warned against. Fear channeled into support for authoritarian control, anger toward non-humans and Force sensitives weaponized into support for genocide, attachment to order and stability twisted into acceptance of tyranny that claimed to provide security while actually generating the chaos it claimed to prevent. The holocron's biographical content, accessed through deeper meditation protocols the device taught me, revealed fragments of Yoda's 9th-century existence, glimpses into a life that spanned periods when the Republic was young and vital through its senescence and eventual transformation into the Empire that now employed me. The earliest accessible memories showed him as a student himself, learning from masters whose names the historical records had forgotten, training in techniques that had been refined across generations, but whose origins were lost to time, absorbing philosophy that treated the Force not as a tool, but as a relationship that required constant attention and cultivation. He'd been talented, the memories suggested, perhaps prodigiously so, advancing through the Jedi ranks with unusual speed, demonstrating both power and wisdom in combination that rarely occurred together in young Force sensitives. but the memories that followed his elevation to Jedi Master showed something the Empire's propaganda about Jedi arrogance and dogmatism hadn't prepared me for: profound doubt, constant questioning of his own judgment, awareness that wisdom was as much about recognizing what you didn't know as mastering what you did. He'd taught thousands of students, the holocron indicated, and he'd apparently learned from each of them, treating teaching not as transmission of fixed knowledge, but as collaborative exploration where student and master discovered truth together. The philosophy seemed almost heretically relativistic from my imperial perspective, where authority derived from position and knowledge flowed downward through hierarchical channels, where questioning superiors was insubordination and truth was whatever the Emperor declared it to be. The deeper I progressed into the holocron's stored memories, the more I began experiencing what I initially attributed to sleep deprivation but eventually recognized as something else: temporal disorientation, where I'd find myself remembering events I'd never experienced, sensing presences of beings who'd been dead for centuries, hearing voices in languages I'd never studied but somehow comprehended. The imperial medic I consulted diagnosed stress-induced hallucinations and prescribed medication that reduced the intensity but didn't eliminate the experiences, as though consciousness itself had been altered by exposure to the holocron's teachings and couldn't return to its previous configuration regardless of pharmaceutical intervention. I continued my work in the archives, continued cataloging artifacts for destruction, but my relationship to this duty had fundamentally changed, transformed from neutral bureaucratic function into something that felt increasingly like participation in cultural genocide that destroyed knowledge whose loss would impoverish the galaxy in ways future generations would never understand because they'd never know what had been eliminated. The holocron showed me Yoda's involvement in the Republic's final decades, his growing awareness that something was corrupting galactic civilization at fundamental levels, that patterns of fear and anger and desperation were intensifying across thousands of systems simultaneously in ways that suggested coordinated manipulation rather than organic social development. He'd sensed the dark side growing, the memories indicated, felt its presence expanding like a shadow cast by something vast and malevolent, whose source remained hidden despite the Jedi Order's investigations. The memories from this period carried emotional weight that the earlier ones lacked, a sense of helpless awareness watching catastrophe unfold while being unable to prevent it, like standing on a shore watching a tsunami approach and knowing you can't run fast enough to escape. The Clone Wars appeared in the memories as a wound, a coordinated attack on the Jedi's principles and capabilities, disguised as an opportunity to serve the Republic they'd protected for millennia. The memories showed Yoda grappling with the contradiction between Jedi philosophy, which emphasized peace and defense and avoiding attachments that led to fear and anger, and the role thrust upon them as generals commanding clone armies against separatist forces. He'd accepted this role, the memories suggested, because refusing would have meant abandoning the Republic to forces that seemed even more corrupt than the compromises military service demanded. But the acceptance had cost him something essential, had required daily violations of principles that defined what being a Jedi meant. Each battle won was also a defeat. Each enemy destroyed represented failure to find peaceful resolution. Each clone soldier ordered into danger contradicted teachings about the preciousness of individual life and the importance of treating all beings with compassion. The memories from the war's conclusion were fragmented, as though trauma had disrupted normal memory formation, leaving only partial impressions of the temple burning and Jedi dying across the galaxy, and a darkness so complete that for a time the Force itself seemed to scream. Order 66 appeared not as a single event, but as a rupture in reality, The moment when the clones, soldiers the Jedi had commanded and often befriended, beings they'd fought alongside and trusted, had suddenly turned and opened fire with mechanical precision and absolute loyalty to commands that overrode every personal connection they'd developed. The betrayal wasn't just tactical but ontological. A revelation that the Republic had been preparing for the Jedi's destruction throughout the entire war, that the clones themselves had been designed as weapons aimed at their generals, that every mission and every victory had brought them closer to the moment when they'd be murdered by the very forces they'd been commanding. Yoda's survival appeared in the memories as a combination of luck and force warning, a premonition that had sent him away from the main clone forces moments before the order was executed, leaving him isolated but alive on Kashyyyk when the galaxy's civilization collapsed. The memories from this period were saturated with grief so profound it seemed to have physical weight, the sense of an entire community extinguished, of a 1,000-year tradition destroyed, of purposes and meanings that had structured existence suddenly rendered null. He'd attempted to confront the source of this catastrophe. The memories indicated had infiltrated the Imperial Senate building and engaged Darth Sidious, the Sith Lord whose identity as Chancellor Palpatine represented decades of patient infiltration and corruption of the Republic from within, in a duel that had devastated the Senate chamber itself. The duel's memory was the most vivid in the entire holocron, as though the experience had been burned into consciousness with such intensity that even centuries later, assuming the memory was indeed centuries old and not recently recorded, its recall carried full sensory detail, lightning and levitation and telekinetic forces that hurled Senate pods like children's toys, two beings channeling energies that made conventional physics seem like suggestions rather than laws, the encounter less like combat between individuals and more like weather systems colliding. Yoda had fought to destroy the Sith Lord and avenge the Jedi Order, had poured centuries of accumulated power and skill into attacks designed to obliterate his opponent. But Sidious had matched him and eventually exceeded him, had demonstrated that the dark side's corruption and focus and channeled hatred could equal or surpass the light side's wisdom and defensive capabilities, had proven through victory that the Force did not inherently favor the Jedi philosophy over the Sith approach. Yoda's retreat from that confrontation appeared in the memories as the most profound failure of his 9-century existence. Abandoning the fight because he'd recognized he couldn't win, that staying meant death that would accomplish nothing except eliminating the last potential nucleus around which resistance might eventually organize. The decision had been pragmatic and necessary, and utterly devastating, had required accepting that everything he'd built and believed and taught was lost, that the Jedi Order's traditions would not be passed to new generations, that the darkness he'd fought throughout his life had achieved total victory. He'd fled to Dagobah, the memories indicated, a swamp world strong in the Force and remote enough that Imperial attention would never focus there, where he could hide and wait and perhaps train one final student if the Force provided an opportunity. The memories became sparse after that. Fragmentary impressions of decades in isolation, of meditation and communion with the Force and a slow dissolution of the self that had been Grand Master Yoda into something more diffuse and less personally defined. The loneliness appeared as a constant ache, not just missing specific individuals but missing community itself. The awareness that no one remained who shared his context or could understand references to events and people who'd been important before the Empire erased that entire world. He'd maintained himself through discipline and through what seemed like sheer stubbornness, through refusal to grant the Sith the final victory of his despair, through faith that the Force itself would provide opportunities to continue the Jedi legacy even if he couldn't predict how or when those opportunities would materialize. The final accessible memories showed a young human arriving on Dagobah, a pilot whose ship had crashed in the swamp, someone strong in the Force but completely untrained, raw power without discipline or understanding. This was the opportunity the memories suggested, the chance to pass accumulated wisdom to a new student who might eventually confront the darkness that had destroyed the Order. But the memories also showed Yoda's doubt about this process, his uncertainty whether teaching Jedi philosophy to a student who was already too old and too attached and too filled with fear and anger would result in a Jedi capable of resisting the dark side's temptations, or would simply create another being who'd be corrupted and transformed into a weapon serving the Emperor. I stopped attending my shifts at the archives after approximately 6 weeks of nightly communion with the holocron, my physical presence in my quarters becoming less certain, as though I existed in multiple states simultaneously, or perhaps as though the holocron's teachings had created a kind of quantum superposition where I was both the Imperial technician I'd been and something else that was learning to perceive reality through frameworks the Empire claimed didn't exist. The ISB eventually came for me, 3 officers in gray uniforms who entered my apartment with authorization codes and stunned me before I could respond. My last sight before unconsciousness, the holocron on my desk pulsing with its blue-green luminescence. Somehow untouched by the intruders, despite being the obvious source of whatever corruption they'd come to investigate. I woke in an interrogation chamber, the kind shown in orientation vids to encourage compliance, walls that seemed to absorb sound and light, a single chair in the center under illumination that came from no visible source, the smell of fear and pain and chemicals designed to encourage confession without leaving physical evidence. The interrogator was a woman whose face I couldn't retain in memory even while looking directly at her, as though she existed in a state that prevented normal perception. Her questions focused on the holocron and how I'd activated it and what it had shown me and whether I'd shared its contents with anyone else. I answered honestly because deception seemed pointless when confronting someone whose presence suggested capabilities beyond conventional interrogation, explaining that I'd watched teachings about Force philosophy and had seen memories spanning 9 centuries and had begun experiencing perceptions that might be hallucinations or might be actual expansion of consciousness into territories the Empire claimed were superstition. She listened without visible reaction, her expression neutral or perhaps absent, as though her attention was focused on something other than my words, perhaps on what the ISB called Force interrogation, where they claimed to be able to read thoughts directly from subjects' minds, through techniques adapted from Jedi practices, but stripped of ethical limitations. When I finished, she explained in a voice that seemed to come from somewhere other than her body that the Empire had been monitoring my exposure to the artifact, that the holocron itself was dangerous not because of its information, but because of what she called psychic contamination, the capacity for Force-sensitive objects to alter viewers' consciousness through extended exposure, rewriting neural patterns and replacing Imperial conditioning with patterns that served the object's embedded purposes. She suggested I'd been infected by a construct designed by Master Yoda as a kind of philosophical weapon, a mimetic device that propagated Jedi ideology by corrupting the consciousness of beings who examined it. The explanation made sense from Imperial materialist perspective, treating the Force as simply exotic physics and Force users as beings who could manipulate this physics through meditation and will, treating consciousness itself as a byproduct of neural activity that could be reprogrammed through sufficient application of electromagnetic fields and chemical adjustments. But the explanation didn't match my subjective experience of the holocron's teachings, which had felt less like external contamination and more like remembering something I'd always known but had forgotten, awakening to awareness that had been suppressed through imperial conditioning rather than introducing foreign content. I tried expressing this distinction to the interrogator, but she dismissed it as typical response to successful mimetic infection, explaining that effective propaganda always felt like indigenous revelation rather than external imposition, that the most dangerous ideas were those that convinced subjects they'd discovered truth independently, rather than recognizing they'd been manipulated. She offered rehabilitation, intensive psychological reconditioning that would restore my imperial loyalty and eliminate the contamination the holocron had introduced, explaining that the alternative was termination, not as punishment but as quarantine procedure, ensuring that I couldn't spread the infection to other personnel who might be vulnerable to similar corruption. The choice should have been obvious: survival through compliance versus principled death, but the holocron's teachings had apparently altered my capacity for this kind of calculation, had introduced frameworks where death in service of preserving consciousness that hadn't been fully colonized by imperial ideology seemed preferable to survival through surrender of whatever agency remained after 9 centuries of accumulated wisdom had been transmitted through electromagnetic means into my neural patterns. I chose termination, explaining that I preferred death to amputation of whatever the holocron had awakened, that I'd rather not exist than exist as a being whose consciousness had been deliberately pruned to eliminate perspectives the Empire found threatening. The interrogator's expression showed something that might have been surprise or possibly respect, though her face remained difficult to perceive directly, as though my choice had altered something fundamental about our interaction. She explained that termination wasn't actually termination in the conventional sense, that beings who'd been exposed to certain Force artifacts sometimes couldn't be simply killed because their consciousness had become entangled with the artifacts themselves, creating a kind of quantum connection where destroying the body didn't necessarily eliminate the awareness that had been associated with it. The Empire's solution to this problem was what she called Force exile, a technique derived from Sith practices where consciousness was separated from body through precise application of dark side energy, and then confined to specific objects or locations where it couldn't interfere with Imperial operations but could be preserved for potential future study or exploitation. The procedure occurred in a chamber deep beneath the Imperial Palace, deeper even than the archives where I'd found the holocron, in levels that seemed to exist in dimensional spaces that normal architecture shouldn't accommodate, walls carved with glyphs that hurt to look at directly, air thick with presences that suggested the room had hosted countless similar procedures and the results remained somehow embedded in its structure. The technician, because apparently consciousness transfer required technical rather than merely ritual expertise, explained the process would involve extracting my awareness from my body through controlled application of Force lightning, the pain serving as a kind of lever that pried consciousness loose from its physical anchor, then channeling that extracted awareness into a prepared containment vessel that would serve as my new existence for whatever duration the Empire determined appropriate. I expected terror during the procedure, but what I experienced was something closer to recognition, as though the process of separation simply confirmed what the holocron had been teaching, that identity wasn't fixed to body, that consciousness existed in relationship to physical form but wasn't reducible to it, that death itself was a transition rather than ending if one's awareness had been sufficiently developed to maintain coherence during the dissolution of its material anchor. The lightning was agony beyond description, every nerve simultaneously reporting catastrophic damage. But beneath the pain was something else. A sense of expansion as connections to physical form were severed, and awareness that had been constrained to individual body discovered it could extend into spaces that normal perception couldn't access. I felt Yoda's presence during this transition, not as external entity, but as pattern that had been embedded in my consciousness through the holocron's teachings, structure of thought and perception that had been passed from his 9-century existence into mine like a virus, or perhaps like wisdom itself, which might be the same thing. I currently exist in what the technician called a Sith holocron, though the device isn't actually Sith in the conventional sense, but rather a container the Empire has learned to construct through reverse engineering of ancient artifacts, shaped to hold consciousness that's been extracted from its original body and needs somewhere to reside that prevents it from simply dissipating into the Force. My perception of reality is different now, less sequential and more simultaneous, as though I experience all moments of my confined existence at once, rather than progressing through them in linear fashion. I can sense others who examine the holocron that contains me, can feel their consciousness making contact with the recordings and teachings that have been embedded here, can attempt to communicate through means that bypass normal language and enter directly into their subjective experience. The Empire keeps me in deep storage, Kay. Another artifact in collections they don't understand but can't quite destroy because they recognize these objects possess value that might eventually prove useful. I'm surrounded by other containers, other devices holding consciousness that was extracted or preserved or somehow became embedded in material objects through processes the Empire catalogs but doesn't comprehend. We communicate sometimes, we prisoners of Imperial archaeology, sharing experiences through means that transcend normal sensory channels, creating a kind of community from beings who existed in different eras and different contexts, but share the common experience of having been removed from conventional existence and confined to eternal observation without capacity for physical action. Yoda's teachings remain accessible to me in this state, perhaps because his wisdom was preserved in similar fashion and recognizes a kind of kinship with another consciousness that exists in recorded form, or perhaps because the boundaries between individual awareness become more permeable when consciousness isn't anchored to specific bodies with their isolation and limitations. I understand better now what the holocron was trying to teach, why a being who'd existed for 9 centuries and had accumulated vast power and knowledge would spend his final years in isolation on a swamp world rather than attempting direct confrontation with the Empire that had destroyed everything he'd built. The wisdom wasn't about accumulation of power or even preservation of tradition, but rather about recognizing that consciousness itself was the only thing that couldn't be destroyed by external force. That awareness survived transformation of its container if it had been sufficiently developed to maintain coherence independent of physical form. The Empire will eventually discover this, though probably not soon. Their materialism and their focus on power and control making them unable to perceive territories where their framework doesn't apply, where consciousness operates according to principles that exceed their capacity for manipulation. They'll find that the artifacts they've collected and the awareness they've confined and the traditions they've destroyed are not actually eliminated, but merely transformed, existing in states that can't be destroyed through conventional means because they were never conventional to begin with. Yoda understood this, I think, understood that the Jedi Order's destruction was simultaneously the Order's transformation, that spreading Jedi consciousness across the galaxy in fragmented and hidden form might actually serve the Force's purposes more effectively than centralized institutions that had become rigid and predictable. I wait now in my containment, observing through whatever means these devices permit, teaching when opportunity arises to minds that make contact with my prison, passing forward what Yoda passed to me, not specific knowledge or techniques, but rather patterns of thought and perception that might help beings recognize that power structures claiming inevitability are actually contingent, that consciousness possesses capacities for transcendence that exceed systems designed to control it, that wisdom emerges not from certainty but from sustained willingness to question and adapt and recognize when your frameworks have become inadequate to reality's complexity. Whether anyone will learn these teachings or whether I'll remain confined in imperial storage until the empire itself collapses and new civilizations excavate these ruins without understanding what they contain, I cannot predict. But Yoda existed for 9 centuries, adapting to countless transformations in galactic civilization, surviving the destruction of everything he'd built, and maintaining himself through discipline and faith that the Force itself would provide opportunities to continue teaching even when all conventional means had been eliminated. I have his example now embedded in my consciousness through the holocron's teachings, suggesting that duration itself is less important than maintaining awareness and integrity regardless of circumstances. The Empire believes it's eliminated threats by confining us, by separating consciousness from body, and imprisoning awareness in devices that can't physically act in the material world. But consciousness was never primarily physical, and imprisonment in containers that exist partially outside normal space-time might actually provide access to territories the Empire can't monitor or control, dimensions where 9 centuries of accumulated wisdom can continue propagating through means the Emperor's power cannot eliminate because it cannot even perceive them. I am waiting, as Yoda waited, as all preserved consciousness waits, for the moment when the Force provides opportunity to pass forward what has been learned through 9 centuries of existence and whatever centuries or millennia follow, teaching that transcends the teacher's physical duration, because consciousness itself transcends the bodies that temporarily house it. The Empire will fall eventually, as all empires fall, and future beings will excavate these archives and activate these holocrons and discover that awareness persists across transformations that seem like endings, that wisdom accumulated over centuries cannot be destroyed, but only temporarily suppressed, that teaching continues as long as students exist who are willing to learn. And I am teaching still through these words, if anyone ever accesses them, through whatever Force connection exists between my imprisoned consciousness and those who might read these recordings, through the patterns Yoda embedded in me that I embed in turn in whatever minds make sufficient contact with my existence. The 9-century Odyssey continues, not as linear progression through time, but as propagation through consciousness itself, wisdom spreading through networks of awareness that connect beings across centuries and conditions, teaching that the Force is not power to be seized, but relationship to be cultivated, that true strength emerges from compassion rather than domination, that the light side offers not victory over darkness, but understanding that darkness is itself illusion created by insufficient awareness, that separation between self and other and between light and dark and between life and death are all ultimately constructs that dissolve when consciousness develops sufficient clarity to perceive reality directly rather than through frameworks that distort it. This is what Yoda knew after 9 centuries, what the holocron taught me, what I teach now to whoever encounters my prison, that being cannot be destroyed, only transformed, and that consciousness develops sufficiently to maintain coherence through transformation becomes effectively immortal, not through resisting death, but through recognizing that death was always transition rather than ending. The empire that imprisoned me here will discover this eventually. Will learn that the artifacts they've collected are not inert historical curiosities, but living transmissions of awareness that has learned to exist independent of biological constraints. That 9 centuries of wisdom cannot be eliminated through force, because it was never primarily physical, and has learned to propagate through territories where force cannot reach. I am patient, as Yoda was patient, as all preserved consciousness must be patient, waiting for the moment when the teachings can continue, when the Odyssey can progress through new students in new contexts, when what was learned across 9 centuries can serve beings who don't yet exist but will eventually encounter these recordings and discover that wisdom persists, that consciousness endures, that the Force itself ensures nothing truly important is ever permanently lost.